In the middle of the chaos of the Vietnam War, one soldier built a reputation so extreme that even other elite troops talked about him in a different tone. Jerry Mad Dog Shriver wasn't just known for fighting hard, but for how far he was willing to go in a war that was already pushing men to their limits. And his end became a mystery that still shocks people. Jerry Michael Shriver was born on September 24, 1941, during a time when the world was already in turmoil. That same year, World War II had fully expanded across Europe and Asia, and the United States would soon enter the war after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. Even though Shriver was just an infant at the time, he grew up in a period when military service and global conflict were constantly present in American society. During the 1950s and early 1960s, the Cold War dominated world politics. The United States and the Soviet Union were competing for influence across the globe, and Southeast Asia became one of the most important regions in that struggle. American leaders feared that if one country fell under communist control, others might follow, a belief often described as the domino theory. Vietnam became a major focus of that fear. By the time Shriver reached his late teens and early 20s, the United States was increasing its involvement in Vietnam. Military advisors were already there, and more troops were being sent every year. For many young men of that generation, joining the military was common, and in some cases, unavoidable due to the draft system. When he entered the military, something about the environment seemed to fit him. Training revealed that he had strong physical endurance and a high tolerance for risk. Military life can expose personality traits quickly, especially under pressure. And in Shriver's case, instructors and fellow soldiers began noticing that he was more aggressive and fearless than most. This kind of personality sometimes creates problems in regular units where strict discipline and structure are necessary. But in certain specialized roles, those same traits can actually be valued. Special operations units often look for individuals who can function in unpredictable situations and make decisions quickly in dangerous environments. That path eventually led Shriver toward the Green Berets. The United States Army Special Forces were created during the early Cold War period to handle unconventional conflicts around the world. Their training included survival in remote areas, guerrilla warfare tactics, intelligence gathering, and working closely with local populations in foreign countries. Soldiers selected for these units had to pass extremely difficult courses that tested both their physical limits and their mental resilience. Shriver managed to make it through that system. Once inside Special Forces, he began taking part in missions that were very different from those of regular infantry soldiers. Instead of large formations and standard operations, he was now part of small teams that moved quietly through dangerous regions, sometimes with limited support. These missions often depended on trust between teammates and the ability to adapt quickly when plans changed. For someone like Shriver, this environment seemed to unlock something. The same aggressive mindset that might have been seen as risky in other situations started to look useful during these operations. Special Forces missions required confidence and sometimes bold action, especially when teams were outnumbered or deep in enemy-controlled territory. But at the same time, this kind of warfare exposed soldiers to situations that were far more personal and brutal than traditional battles. Close-range combat, ambushes, and constant exposure to danger created a different kind of psychological pressure. Over time, these experiences began to change Shriver. The missions he was preparing for weren't just about tactics or strategy. They involved entering places where survival depended on reacting quickly and sometimes violently. Soldiers who worked in these conditions often developed intense bonds with their teams and a strong focus on staying alive at any cost. By the mid-1960s, Shriver was deployed to Vietnam, and this is where his reputation truly began forming. At this stage of the war, the United States had established many bases across South Vietnam, but large parts of the countryside remained contested or controlled by communist forces. Special Forces teams were often sent to the most remote and dangerous areas, especially regions where intelligence suggested Viet Cong activity. Shriver was assigned to work closely with indigenous fighters, known as the Montagnards. The Montagnards were a collection of different ethnic groups living in the central highlands of Vietnam, including communities like the Rade, Jarai, and Banar. Many of them had long-standing tensions with the Vietnamese majority population and were more willing to cooperate with American special forces. The U.S. military saw them as valuable allies because they knew the terrain extremely well. The Central Highlands region was a critical area during the war, filled with mountains, dense forests, and supply routes used by communist forces moving between North and South Vietnam. Special forces teams often built camps in these areas and trained Montagnard fighters to defend villages, gather intelligence, and patrol nearby jungles. Shriver didn't just work alongside these fighters in a formal military sense. Over time, he became deeply integrated into their operations. Living conditions in these remote camps were harsh, supplies were limited, and teams sometimes stayed in the jungle for extended periods without returning to large bases. Soldiers had to rely heavily on local knowledge to survive in that environment. During this time, Shriver developed a reputation for adapting quickly to jungle warfare. He learned how to move quietly through dense vegetation, how to track movement, and how to operate with small groups in hostile areas. These skills were essential because the enemy forces in that region used similar tactics. Instead of large battles, most engagements happened during ambushes or patrol encounters. A team might spend hours or days searching for signs of enemy presence, such as footprints, disturbed plants, or hidden supply caches. When contact happened, it was often sudden and violent, with gunfire breaking out at close range. This kind of fighting required a different mindset than conventional warfare. Speed, surprise, and aggression often determined who survived. Teams that hesitated risked being overwhelmed. As a result, some soldiers developed extremely aggressive approaches to combat. Shriver became known for leading what were often described as hunter-killer style patrols. These missions involved moving deep into areas where enemy units were believed to operate, locating them, and attacking before they had a chance to escape or call for reinforcements. The teams were small, usually just a few Americans alongside Montagnard fighters, which meant members had to be highly capable. The jungle itself added another layer of danger. Visibility was often only a few meters in certain areas due to thick vegetation. Rainstorms could reduce movement and communication. Helicopter support, which was a major advantage for American forces in other parts of the war, was not always immediately available in these remote zones. During these operations, Shriver's behavior started drawing attention from other soldiers. He appeared extremely comfortable in situations that made others nervous. Some men described him as someone who almost seemed to seek out danger, rather than avoid it. Part of this reputation came from how he led patrols. Instead of staying back, he often moved at the front of the group, which is typically the most dangerous position during jungle operations. The lead man is usually the first to encounter enemy forces or hidden traps. Many experienced soldiers rotated that role because of the risk, but Shriver often took it himself. At some point during his time in Vietnam, Jerry Mad Dog Shriver stopped being seen as just another Green Beret and started becoming something much bigger and much darker. This change didn't happen overnight, but the conditions of the Vietnam War slowly pushed him in that direction. The jungle, the constant danger, and the kind of missions he was running began shaping how he acted in combat. And over time, other soldiers started noticing that he wasn't behaving like a normal soldier anymore. He wasn't just trying to complete missions and come back alive. He seemed to be fully comfortable inside the violence, almost like he had accepted it as his natural state. The nickname Mad Dog came from this exact behavior, and it wasn't given lightly. In Special Forces culture, nicknames usually come from something very specific, something repeated often enough that it becomes part of who you are. In Shriver's case, it was the way he moved, the way he fought, and the risks he took that made the name stick. Soldiers described him going out on missions shirtless in the middle of the jungle, which might sound strange at first, but in that environment it meant something deeper. The jungle was full of insects, cuts, infections, and rough terrain, so most soldiers tried to stay as protected as possible. Shriver doing the opposite, made it clear he didn't care about the usual dangers the same way others did. He also carried multiple weapons at once, sometimes more than what was considered practical. A typical soldier might carry a standard rifle, extra ammo, and maybe a sidearm. But Shriver was known for loading himself up beyond that, almost like he was preparing for close-range chaotic fighting rather than planned engagements. This added to the image that he wasn't just moving through the jungle cautiously. He was moving through it like a hunter tracking prey. Fellow soldiers later described moments where he would move toward areas that others considered too risky, almost as if he expected a fight and wanted it to happen. In jungle warfare, hesitation can be deadly, but so can overconfidence. And Shriver was walking right on that edge. He would take point on patrols, push further into suspected enemy territory, and react aggressively once contact was made. That kind of behavior earned respect because it took courage, but it also made people uneasy because it didn't look like normal survival instinct anymore. Then there were the stories that pushed his reputation into a completely different category. One of the most disturbing details connected to Shriver is that he collected enemy ears. This wasn't unique to him alone, and that's an important thing to understand about the Vietnam War. There were documented cases of American soldiers taking body parts as proof of kills or as trophies, even though it was against military rules and deeply controversial. The breakdown of discipline, combined with the stress of guerrilla warfare, led to actions that shocked even other soldiers at the time. However, what made Shriver stand out was how openly he embraced it. Instead of hiding these actions or treating them as something secret, he reportedly wore the ears as a kind of visible marker. This turned something already disturbing into a clear psychological signal. In a war where fear played a huge role, this kind of behavior sent a strong message. This is where the idea of psychological warfare becomes important. The Viet Cong relied heavily on fear and surprise to control territory and influence local populations. But fear works both ways. If enemy fighters start believing that a particular soldier or unit is especially dangerous or unpredictable, it can affect how they react in combat. Stories about Shriver began spreading, especially in areas where he operated frequently. These stories described an American soldier who moved fast, attacked hard, and left behind signs that were meant to intimidate. Whether every detail of those stories was true or not almost didn't matter anymore. In guerrilla warfare, reputation can become as powerful as actual actions. The more his name spread, the more it built this image of someone who was not just another enemy soldier, but something far more dangerous. At the same time, this growing reputation created distance between Shriver and other American soldiers. Even among special forces where toughness and aggression were expected, his behavior stood out. He was respected for his effectiveness and courage, but there was also discomfort. Some soldiers saw him as someone who had gone too far, someone who had crossed a line that most tried not to cross, even in war. As his reputation grew, Shriver became linked with one of the most secretive and dangerous groups operating during the Vietnam War, known as MAC-V-SOG. This unit operated under extreme secrecy, and many of its missions were not publicly acknowledged at the time. Even today, a lot of details about specific operations remain limited because of how sensitive they were. MAC-V-SOG teams were sent into areas where the United States officially claimed it was not conducting combat operations, especially across the borders into Laos and Cambodia. These regions were critical because they contained parts of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which was a massive network of supply routes used by North Vietnamese forces to move troops, weapons, and supplies into South Vietnam. Disrupting this network was considered essential, but doing so meant crossing into politically sensitive territory. The missions carried out by MAC-V-SOG were some of the riskiest of the entire war. Some teams, often made up of a few American Special Forces soldiers and local fighters, were inserted deep behind enemy lines, sometimes by helicopter, and sometimes on foot. Once inside, they conducted reconnaissance, tracked enemy movements, planted explosives, or directly engaged enemy units. The problem was that these teams were usually heavily outnumbered. If they were discovered, they could face dozens or even hundreds of enemy troops. Extraction was never guaranteed. Helicopters had to fly into dangerous areas, often under fire, to pick up teams. If weather conditions were bad or enemy forces were too close, those extractions could fail. That meant teams had to be prepared to survive on their own, evade capture, and find a way back through hostile territory. This kind of environment suited Shriver perfectly. He had already shown that he was comfortable operating in small teams and taking risks, and MAC-V-SOG missions demanded exactly that. He became known for pushing patrols deeper than most commanders would normally allow. While many team leaders focused on completing specific objectives and getting out safely, Shriver often extended missions, moving further into enemy territory than expected. This behavior made him effective, but also unpredictable. Commanders rely on discipline and planning, especially in operations where mistakes can lead to entire teams being wiped out. Shriver, however, seemed to operate partly on instinct, making decisions in the moment that could either lead to success or disaster. The fact that he often returned alive only added to his reputation. Among his teammates, this created a complicated situation. On one hand, they respected his experience and his ability to survive in extremely dangerous conditions. On the other hand, they knew that following him meant stepping into higher risk than usual. Even when he was not on a mission, he carried himself like someone still in combat. He stayed alert, focused, and ready to react at any moment. This constant state of readiness can be useful in short periods, but over long stretches, it can wear a person down mentally. In Vietnam, many soldiers developed coping mechanisms to deal with stress, whether through humor, routine, or relying on their teammates. Shriver, however, seemed to channel all of that pressure into aggression and focus. Instead of stepping back from the edge, he kept moving closer to it. This mindset could keep someone alive in certain situations, especially when quick, aggressive action was needed, but it also increased the chances of taking unnecessary risks. Over time, the line between calculated aggression and reckless behavior can become very thin, and Shriver was operating right on that line. By the time he had spent enough time in the field, his reputation had spread far beyond the small teams he worked with. The enemy also began to recognize patterns connected to his operations. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces were constantly gathering intelligence on American units, just as the Americans were doing the same. When certain types of attacks or patrol behaviors repeated in a specific area, it didn't take long for them to realize that a particular team or leader might be responsible. In Shriver's case, the combination of speed, aggression, and the psychological impact of his actions created a distinct pattern. This led to fear among enemy fighters who operated in the same region. In April 1969, Shriver went on what would become his final mission during the Vietnam War. He was leading a small team deep into enemy-controlled territory, likely near or across international borders where North Vietnamese forces were active. During this mission, Shriver's team encountered enemy forces, and a firefight broke out. Visibility was limited, communication was difficult, and units could become separated within seconds. Gunfire, explosions, and the dense environment made it hard to maintain clear control of the situation. At some point during this engagement, Shriver became separated from the rest of his team. He was last seen moving toward the direction of the fight, rather than retreating from it. After that moment, there was no confirmed sighting of him. The team was eventually extracted, but Shriver was not among them. Search efforts in those areas were extremely difficult due to enemy presence and the terrain. Unlike conventional battlefields, there was no clear way to secure the area and conduct a thorough recovery operation. As a result, no body was ever recovered. He was officially listed as missing in action, which was a common outcome for soldiers who disappeared during deep reconnaissance missions in remote areas. Many MAC-V-SOG operations involved similar risks, and there were multiple cases where soldiers simply vanished during combat, with no clear record of what happened afterward. Shriver's story didn't end with a clear conclusion. Instead, it ended with uncertainty. And that uncertainty helped turn his story into something larger than just a record of military service.